Alex, it's time to talk about the future of the Dallas Cowboys because this is an interesting offseason for Dallas, and I think their future is really going to come into play when you look at the contracts with some of their best players. Let's start with Dak Prescott because after this Trevor Lawrence deal, Prescott is a guy that I think could be looking to become the NFL's first $60 million player. There's no reason he shouldn't be asking for money in that ballpark. Now, we know they need to pay CeeDee Lamb. Micah Parsons is the other key player that we need to look at here. But CeeDee Lamb is another guy that I think could be looking at some Justin Jefferson type of money, $35 million a year average. I think at the least he should be in that ballpark. And then, like I mentioned, Micah Parsons, you've got a guy who's in his prime, a young player, arguably a top 3 pass rusher in the NFL, very versatile defender. I think he should be asking for money in that Nick Bosa range of $34 million a year. This is a money problem for Dallas.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest issues that they have going forward. Now, let's nerd out for a minute, right? So I took the liberty to look at the cap, look at what they did. Now, they were initially had about 100 million going into next season, but remember, they did restructure Dak's contract and push 40 million into next season. So that 40 is now actually 65. That number I just averaged up and to make numbers clean. So when we talk about them, it makes the perfect amount of sense. So right now they would be sitting at 65 million in cap space. The cap number is at 255. The expectation is going to go up another 25. So we added 25 to that 65 to make it 90 million across the board. Now let's talk about if you want to keep Dak. And again, we'll just dig deep and then we'll talk about each number. You talked about 60 million. I just looked at the most recent numbers. Obviously, Trevor Lawrence got got paid, with his money, his 275 and 200. Then you had Burrow that had 275 and 219. Both of them average out to 55. And then you got Goff, who got a restructure this year, who got 212, 170. Then there's Herbert at 262 and 194. And he's at 52 million, as is Lamar. Now, if you're Dak, you're saying I'm going to only be 31 when the season starts. And remember, initially when he signed his contract, they wanted him to take the extra year. He did it for this reason here, is that he would be in line to get another huge contract before he hits that weird 34, 33, 34 when they're like, okay, we can move on. But no, I'm still 31. And regardless of what anybody thinks, he's still a top 10, possibly top 8 quarterback in this league, at least during the regular season. Now, let's just say if I'm Dak's agent, at minimum, I'm looking at 4 years, 212 million, 180 guaranteed. It puts me right under Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow, but puts me right above Goff at 170 and a 180 guaranteed. And that puts me at 53 million, which ties me with Goff. So that number, if we just simply take that number and we just use clean numbers, we can play with the cap all we want to. You take that 90, you minus the 53, that brings you down to 37 for free agent money next year. What do you think about that number and that breakdown?
Yeah. So when I'm looking at it, and I talked about some of the numbers that I think these guys could be asking for, because you want to talk about market value, right? I think the Cowboys would have to pay all 3 of these guys combined. We're talking $130 million per season, roughly, when you combine those numbers. So even if we assume the salary cap rises another, let's say 10%, that brings the salary cap to $281 million for 2025. The average salaries of those 3 players combined, if they land those market level deals, is going to be about 46% of the 2025 cap. You just can't pay all 3 of these guys market deals. And that's just the bottom line. And we've seen already that they've already had to make tough decisions, Alex. They lost offensive tackle Tyron Smith, center Tyler Biadasz, running back Tony Pollard, Dorrance Armstrong, Jonathan Hankins. I mean, this is not a roster that's going to be as good as it was last year because of the tough financial decisions they've had to make. Now you've got tougher ones with these 3 key players. And look, if I'm Jerry Jones, I'm not paying CeeDee Lamb. And he's a great player and a really good wide receiver. But I think wide receiver might be the easiest position to replace through the draft. I'm not saying you're going to find a CeeDee Lamb overnight, but you can find high-quality players in the draft every year, it feels like, at receiver especially. Now, quarterback is the most difficult to replace. I think we know that. But you can make a case that we've seen Dak's best football And we've seen it on some pretty loaded rosters. Now, I know you said he's 30, going to be 31 this season, but he's never been good enough to compete for a ring. And with this massive contract extension, how do they expect to compete for a championship with even less resources to build a good team around him? I mean, look, he's always been a quarterback in that, like you said, kind of in that bottom half of the top 10. He's good, not great, and he's almost never great in big games.
Right. So Cowboy fans are probably thinking and saying, well, we can sign all three because they don't understand the numbers so much. And they're probably sitting and saying, well, we'll figure it out. And like you said, if you have these three guys, you have to make a decision between these three guys because, like Brad said, it's two. You cannot, let's just average it out. You can't have 50% of your cap wrapped up in three players. That's bad business. Even if it's Tom Brady, Jerry Rice, and Lawrence Taylor. Somebody still has to go. You still can't keep all three. It still wouldn't be good business to keep all three. And we're just talking about, I'm just using that level of player in terms of how they look at and where they're structured in the money. Because even with CeeDee Lamb, again, just to nerd out, he would be looking at probably 4 for 135 and about 100 million guaranteed because Triple J's is 4 for 140 and 110 and comes to 35. And AJ Brown is at 96 and 84, which comes to 32. Well, if you're CeeDee Lamb and his agent, you're saying, well, I'm better than him and anybody else behind him. I should definitely be number two. So I'm coming in. If he got 140, I want 130. I want 135. He got 110 guaranteed. Well, I want 100 guaranteed, and that puts him at about 33.75. And if you even add that to what we just said, that left him with 37. Now remember, these guys are immediate unrestricted free agents, so you're either signing them, franchising them, or they're walking. So this money is going to hit the cap immediately. So if you take that 33.75, subtract that from the 37, that would leave them with 3.25 million in free agency money next year. And it makes absolutely no sense. So to your point, Brad, it's looking like probably CeeDee Lamb is the one guy that's going to be left out in the cold in this situation as they have the extra year on Micah. And just real quick, you talked about the Nick Bosa numbers. His numbers were 5 for 170, 88 guaranteed, averaging out to 34. Well, if I'm Micah, I'm resetting the market, right? Because he's going to become free agent. This is going to be 2 years later where they're going to be twice as, I don't want to say twice as higher, but they're going to get, let's just say, if it's 25 per year, let's just leave it at 25. So there's going to be 25 bump this year, another 25 next year, and another 25 after that. So that will put them at an extra 50 million, quote unquote, to spend on him. I'm going in there, if I'm Micah, based upon the averages and how this looks, I'm going in there, I'm asking for 5. I'm asking 200 for 5 years, 100 guaranteed, and that's going to average me out at 40. These numbers are going to get out of control. We've seen some talk about we need to start capping some of these things and maybe start restructuring a different way. But if you're the Cowboys, and I just broke down some of the numbers to you, keep that in mind when you're just sitting there saying, hey, we want to keep this guy, and hey, we should be able to keep all three. Keep the money aspect of this in mind, even though you can play with the cap, but it's very important that you understand the breakdown, the structure, and what their actual value is, because all three of them can really go in there and ask for top 3 money.
Yeah, and they're not going to get it because, like we said, they're going to have tough decisions to make. And if I'm Jerry Jones, my top priority would be to sign Micah Parsons. That's the one guy out of these three that I feel like you cannot let walk. Elite pass rushers are at a premium in this era of football, and I think they're the most difficult to replace outside of quarterback. Now, don't get me wrong, replacing a quarterback is the toughest, and so that's why I think the move off of Dak is going to be tough for them, but he's just become too expensive for a guy that's never shown he can elevate his game when it matters the most. So for me, pay Micah Parsons. You have an elite top 5, arguably top 3 defender in the game in his prime. Give him the money. He can be a building block for you. Like I said, you can replace wide receivers a lot easier. And as tough as it may be, it might be time to move away from Dak Prescott and start over.